Welcome, everybody. We're very pleased you've joined us today. I'm Sharon Wilkie, and on behalf of the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, we're very happy that you've joined us for the exclusive launch of Graham Allison's new book that's Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? So we're glad you're here, and we know that you're going to have ahead of you a lively discussion. I want to call your attention to a few points. First of all, we want to thank our hosts here at First Parish for sharing their space, their wonderful historic space with us today. And they've asked us to remind you of a couple of things. Exits are located where you entered on the Mass Ave entrance, and also on both sides here onto Church Street, and if you needed to on that side too. You won't need those, but just in case. Restrooms are around the corner here and also upstairs. And also be sure to put your cell phones on silent. We're going to conclude this evening's program with book sales and signing and a reception. The reception will be right through these doors in the next room, and we hope that you'll all join us for that. And the book sales and signing, for that after this program, line up along the side here. The books will be for sale here, and Graham will be signing books up here. So we hope you'll join us for that. There'll be Destined for War copies will be available for sale. And now I'm very, very pleased to welcome United States Ambassador, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, and Harvard Kennedy School professor and Belfer Center Director, Graham Allison.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here with Graham Allison to talk about a really important book, which we'll get to here in just a sec. I want to recognize the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, who's joined us tonight, and Mrs. Ban, who've done so much together for the cause of peace and security. And I want to thank all of you for coming out. It's a glorious spring day. Parents, students, friends of families, you could be doing a lot of things, and this is exactly where you belong. So I also want to take account of the fact that one of us is dressed for success this evening. It is not me. I'm making up for lost time. I had to wear all those suits for 8 years. He's going to sing for his supper later. So I did want to explain where this is a wardrobe malfunction of the Harvard variety. Anyway, the first thing I want to do is give Graham the floor, which after all the years he's put into this book, he certainly deserves to sort of summarize and give us the high-level version. But before I do that, I want to say a word about him and the contribution he's made over a lifetime. In addition to basically being the founding spirit behind the entire Kennedy School, he also built something called the Belfer Center, which many of you know well. He has just allegedly stepped down from running the Belfer Center, is just about to. The chances of that happening are similar to the chances of Donald Trump securing peace in the Middle East in the next fortnight. Not going to happen in the next fortnight at least, but he will be formally stepping down. But his entire corpus, I think, is one that one should bear in mind as one looks at this book. It is very, very rare in academic life to make such a meaningful contribution on both sides of one's career. Essence of Decision is a landmark book with timeless lessons that I encouraged everyone on my staff to read when I worked in government for the 8 years. And now we have in Thucydides' Trap something that I think is going to be comparable. It's going to be something everybody feels they have to read to situate themselves in history. But more than that, what the book brings is an academic's rigor, depth, empirics, but a policymaker's sensibility as well, because Graham served, of course, in the U.S. government, and that you really feel on every page. It's a realistic book. It's a book about the room where it happens, as it were, and what happens in those rooms, and that's what makes it all the more valuable. So that's just a top-line endorsement of this book. There is a book signing. I really do encourage parents of graduates. It's the perfect send-off gift from Harvard. But Graham, without further ado, why don't you tell us a little bit about what motivated the book and where you landed after all those years of labor?
Thank you. very much, Samantha. And it's a pleasure to have Samantha back at Harvard and at the Kennedy School and at the Belfer Center. And let me just say a word about Samantha's service before I pick up her question. So Samantha, I had the good fortune to get to know when a colleague said there was a third-year law student who seemed extremely talented, didn't have much to do because in the third year of the law school, they don't require you to do much, and could probably be commandeered as a researcher for the Belfer Center to help develop a project on human rights. That grew into the Carr Center of Human Rights at the Belfer, at the Kennedy School, of which we're very proud. And Samantha then joined the Obama administration right from the get-go. She was first a senior staff person at the National Security Council, and then for the last 4 years as the U.S. ambassador to the UN. So the idea that Harvard students grow up to be ambassadors to the UN and do such an extraordinary job, because Samantha has always been more about doing than about being. So in jobs, she likes to do things and accomplish things. If tonight we'll do another night on Samantha, because I could spend the whole time talking about the remarkable things she did in that job, and I'm so happy that she's been a colleague over these years and that she's going to be a colleague now back at the Belfer Center and the Kennedy School. But let me say a word about the book. So I am not a China specialist. I'm a student of national security decision-making, great power relations, the Soviet Union. I'm an old Cold Warrior. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, I was much involved in trying to organize, in effect, a Marshall Plan equivalent to try to embrace a democratizing Russia as it emerged. So I've been involved in nuclear issues, whatever. Over the last decade, though, more and more I had a sense China is becoming the big story. I was a little late to the topic. I then had good fortune to have three great tutors on the topic. My professor from when I was a student, a graduate student, Henry Kissinger, whom I was just talking to on the phone an hour ago. He's going to turn 94 next week. His mind is still sharp as it's ever been. So Henry always said, you got to learn something about China. Actually, as I tell the story in the book, he didn't know anything about China either. He became the national security advisor to President Nixon. President Nixon had decided we were going to go to China, and he told Kissinger this is going to be a big initiative. Kissinger came home to Cambridge and got a weekend tutorial, as I tell the story in the book, from John Fairbank, the great dean of American Studies of China. And Fairbank told him, wait, this is a 5,000-year history. You know about Europe. You're not going to be able to understand it. But in any case, particularly I think because he's a German originally, but an American now, Henry can often see through more than just narrow American eyes, and became fascinated by China, and ultimately played a historic role in what was the opening to China. In any case, secondly, Lee Kuan Yew, the founder and builder of Singapore, whom I had the good fortune to know for many, many years, and about whom, with some colleagues, I wrote a book back 4 years ago. And Lee Kuan Yew was certainly the world's premier China watcher. He felt and understood China in detail, in particular because every Chinese leader, from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, the current leader, called Lee Kuan Yew mentor. So leaders wanted to spend time with him because they wanted to ask him questions. So as opposed to, professors trying to study something from a distance or intelligence officers reading what somebody says, Lee Kuan Yew spent thousands of hours of FaceTime with these folks and had a real sense and appreciation. And then finally, again, wonderful Harvard stories. The person who is Xi Jinping, the president of China's #1 advisor for economics and also for American affairs, is a fellow named Liu He. Liu He was a student at the Kennedy School 20 years ago. So I've had a chance to know him over these many years. In any case, so I began studying. In this book, what's the big idea? Just briefly. So the big idea is Thucydides trap. And I know many people have difficulty, who's Thucydides and how do you pronounce this? But we're Harvard people, so we're going to do it in unison so you know how to say this. Thucydides trap. So one more time. Thucydides trap. Okay. So who Thucydides? Thucydides was the father of history. He's the first person who thought the job was of a historian to write down the facts and get them accurately and analyze them. That was his job. And he does that brilliantly in a book called The Peloponnesian War. Thucydides wrote famously, it was the rise of Athens and the fear that this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. So he was analyzing the rise and fear in the two great city-states of classical Greece. The Thucydides trap is the dynamic, the dangerous dynamic that occurs when a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. And in the book, I look at the last 500 years. I find 16 cases in which a rising power threatened to displace a ruling power. In 12 of them, the outcome is war. In 4 of them, the outcome is not war. So actually, when Thucydides said inevitable, that's an exaggeration. That's hyperbole. That's emphasis. He means just likely. But I say in the book, and I believe, that in the relationship between a rising China and a ruling U.S., business as usual will likely produce history as usual. And that's not where we want to go, because no one in China, no serious person, and no serious American wants a war between the U.S. and China. But in the conditions of stress that occur when a rising power is threatening to displace a ruling power, events in third arenas that would otherwise be negligible or inconsequential can end up being sparks that produce not just fires, but conflagrations that nobody wanted and nobody could have imagined. And if you want just an example to think about how the assassination of an archduke in Sarajevo by a terrorist in 1914 struck a match that produced a conflagration so devastating that at the end of it, all the European houses had burned down. And it was necessary for historians to create a whole new category. That's why it's called World War I.
Okay. So we have the upshot and the role of history, and what the book does is it goes through all of these cases, summarizes the key cases, and looks at how accommodation and that transition has occurred peacefully and offers an account as to why, but also very chillingly, and this is where I come back to Graham's experience in the government, talks about the various triggers or sort of innocent incidents that can unleash a set of dynamics that lead to war. And he uses very concrete cases related to cyber and the threats, of course, that we have faced from the Chinese government. There's a great line in the book, not Graham's line, in fact, but quoting Jim Comey, I think in 2014, saying, the FBI director saying, there are only 2 types of American companies these days: those who have been hacked by the government of China, or excuse me, those who know that they've been hacked by the government of China, and those who've been hacked by the government of China and don't know it. So there's the cyber dimension, there's the South China Sea, and then there's just a set of structural encounters within global institutions like the UN, which the Secretary General knows best here, and all around the world. What I wanted to get at least in this first round of questioning, we are going to open it up to the audience as quickly as we can, is one of the darker dimensions of the book, which is as you talk about the trend lines, China's growth, the set of, you should tick through when you respond to this question, the set of measurements on which China is now has surpassed the United States, and maybe share the anecdote about how you engage your class on that matter. But we see the metrics for power, and then you have a long discussion about our kind of domestic brittleness and the dysfunction in our democracy now. You allude to some of the brittleness of the Chinese system, but inevitably, to your opening remarks, you know American dysfunction better than you know Chinese brittleness. I think it's fair to say. We all do, as we live it every day. But talk a little bit, I think one of the critiques of the book that you hear from time to time, or the narrative, is, their growth and their rise is taken as foreordained and just a graph that keeps going in the same direction, and it doesn't take into account some of the deformities within the system, the governing system especially, of China, and with a population of 1.4 billion, the environmental issues, urbanization. Why is the trend line just this? We're where we are, kind of, poking along here, and then our brittleness creates a new vulnerability for us, but somehow theirs goes on less spoken about or less considered. Speak to that.
Okay, so great area to dig down on, and I could spin too long on it, so let me try to do the brief version. So in the beginning of this chapter, called The Biggest Player in the History of the World, which is a quote from Lee Kuan Yew, I tell the story of going to see David Petraeus just shortly after he became director of CIA. And I have known him for a long time. And I said, how does he like the job? Oh, it's great. How is he finding it? Oh, it's so exciting. Then I asked him, well, have people started opening some of the jewel boxes for you at CIA? And he said, yes, I've learned some secrets and so forth and so on. I said, well, have they told you much about the deep sleepers? And he began to be looking and very interested, getting up in his chair. And I said, the people who the CIA established a relationship with decades ago, and who were asked simply to go understand the societies in which they lived, and then from time to time, somebody might ask them a question, and they were hoping that that would be helpful. And he was fascinated. I pulled out of my briefcase a 50-page memo, and I said, I had a report from one about China. Oh, my goodness. So he was almost across the table, and I said, here, for example, are Xi Jinping and his colleagues serious about displacing the U.S. as the number one power in Asia in the foreseeable future? I said, answer, yes, of course. Who could imagine otherwise? How could they not be? Or two, what is their strategy for doing this? And I read him the answer. Then I said to him, okay, here. This is a report from Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew was nobody's spy, you can be for sure. Lee Kuan Yew was for Singapore. But he watched China, and he learned a lot about China, and he felt China. So what he kept helping me try to understand is, never has a country risen so far, so fast, on so many different dimensions. And it's just breathtaking. When you look at the numbers, it's breathtaking. Václav Havel, the former president of Czech, has a line that I quote in the book. He says, things have happened so fast, we haven't yet had time to be astonished. So a country that when Ronald Reagan was elected had a GDP 10% of the U.S., in 2014 came to be equal to the U.S. by the measurement of purchasing power parity, which CIA and the IMF say is the best single metric for comparing economies, and will by 2024 be half again larger. Say, what? I give a quiz in my class that Samantha refers to, and I have a little version of it in the book, which I give them 26 indicators. And the question is, when could China become number one? So number one manufacturer of cars, of smartphones, of artificial intelligence, of supercomputers. So we have 26. And economy, biggest economy. And most Harvard students say, well, maybe 2040 for this, but this one not in my lifetime, whatever. Then I show them the second chart, and it says already. Okay? So every one of these, it gives the year in which this already happened. So in a single generation, so if you go back a generation ago, 95 out of 100 Chinese were desperately poor. Now, 2 out of 100 are desperately poor. This is the most amazing anti-poverty story ever. If you look at, I had a piece in the Globe last week, even for STEM preparation in the STEM topics and engineering schools, the U.S. News and World Report on engineering schools now makes Tsinghua to be number one over MIT. Okay? Now, again, you can have some arguments about how about this. So basically, the proposition is you look at this series, be astonished. That's number one. Number two, then, Samantha, very good question. Well, but how about these trend lines? Are they going to continue forever? Which answers, a trend line that cannot continue forever won't. So at some point, these will turn down. But while the biggest story, if you read the newspapers about China's economy, if you do a word search, as I point out, for the last 3 years, it's called China Economic Slowdown. And the biggest word for describing U.S. economy the last 3 years is U.S. economic recovery. And I say, well, how is the recovering U.S. comparing to the slowing China? To which the answer is China's slowing economy is growing at 3 times the rate of the recovering U.S. economy. So U.S. economy has never averaged more than about 2% a year since the beginning of the century. China has never averaged less than 6.5% since the beginning of the century. Indeed, one of my colleagues wrote last year this piece on, well, India is going to grow faster than China. And I wrote back to him, I said, look at the increment of growth in China each 2 years since the financial crisis here. Every 2 years, just the increment of growth in the Chinese economy has been larger than the whole economy of India. It seems impossible to believe, but that's just the numbers. So does China have huge problems internally? Yes, absolutely. Indeed, if I looked at the problems that I would think about, way large. So I would not like to have Xi Jinping's problems. And I try to describe those in the chapter on what Xi Jinping wants.
I think that I just want to share one of the other sort of eye-popping statistics in the book on China's rise, which I fixated on, which is between 2011 and 2013, China both produced and used more cement than the United States did in the entire 20th century. You got to use that one.
Yes,
that's
exactly.
That's the reaction you're seeking.
Let me give you one other one. I was giving a presentation on this, and I'm sorry we don't have slides. In fact, we'll put it up on the website. But basically, those of us who enjoy the reconstruction or rehabilitation of the Anderson Bridge, which is this bridge that runs between the Kennedy School and the Business School that I see every day. So that bridge was first discussed when I was dean of the Kennedy School to refurbish it. The construction project first began in 2012. It was to be finished in 2 years. It's going to be finished in what's called question mark now. It's already 3 times over. So how long does it take in China to reconstruct a bridge twice as large as the Anderson Bridge? You can go to YouTube and look at this. YouTube, China Bridge. This is a bridge in Beijing that in 2014 was reconstructed. It's twice as large. I've driven across it. 43 hours. 43 hours. You can watch the timestamp on the thing go. Now, of course, they work at night. Yeah, my goodness, at night. And they work, lots of people working all the time. But the traffic is not backed up for 4 years, that's for sure.
Well, we all know that well, how to put this? One of the things the book, I think, makes plain is that we in the United States are not sufficiently aware, as some of the gasps tonight, and I'm sure you've heard from other audiences suggest, but we're not aware, and your students' responses certainly indicate, of kind of comparable strengths, particularly in the economic sphere. However, again, back to the domestic puzzle, both here and there, it does seem the case, and you make this point in the book, that their preoccupation with their own internal challenges is at least, if not a diversion from this, stated objective of wanting to rule the world and shape the world more along the lines of a world order that benefits them than along the lines of a 1945 world order that we shaped with our interests in mind. How does that preoccupation with holding it all together, how does that fit with the ambitions and the trend lines as you describe them?
So again, a great topic, and we should have this is a great topic for a lengthy conversation. Let me make 3 quick points. First point, I think if you ask about the challenges that Xi Jinping faces, and Liu He, when you talk to him, Liu He has a list of 18 questions. He says, all these are almost impossible. And they're all at home. So huge, huge challenges. Of course, I would say we might think about that in our own case. We have huge, huge challenges at home. So that's number one. Number two, I think to be clear, I do not believe the Chinese leadership has an aspiration to rule the world or shape the world per se. They have an aspiration, as Xi Jinping would put it, to make China great again. And by making China great again, they simply mean we want to grow up to be the big and strong country that we imagine that we were for all of our life for 5,000 years until the last 200 years when Westerners came here and intervened in our country and took advantage of us and humiliated us and so forth. So they think of themselves just kind of going back to their natural way. Now, their natural way happens to be at the top of a hierarchy in which everybody else kowtows to show their respect. But so that's their picture. Then third and finally, I think your point is absolutely on target. In the conclusion of the book, I talk a bit about how this might work out well as opposed to badly. And if you just imagine that there were adult supervision, we all know that there's not, okay? International affairs is just us, and just countries that live in an anarchy, and just people like President Trump or President Xi or Prime Minister Abe. But in any case, I imagine, for example, that there were adult supervision. Maybe it's a Martian strategist, just hypothetically. And this Martian strategist comes down to Mar-a-Lago to see Trump and Xi. And Xi says, guys, I have a couple of points for you, okay? Just a couple of points. First, let me talk to each of you. You have huge problems, 99 problems each, that I don't think you're going to be able to solve. And all those problems lie within your border. So if you thought about what really you have as your problems, there are problems at home first. Now, you may want to try to externalize them because you're not dealing with them yourself. But if you solve the problems at home, you may have an opportunity abroad. If you fail to solve the problems at home, you're not going to have opportunity abroad. And your first and most important problem is whether you can govern yourself. And she would tell that to both of them. And she would say, you're trying to make an autocracy run with a party that you say is the vanguard and everybody else should defer to. Well, that hasn't worked out too well historically. And you guys are trying to make a democracy work. But as even Lincoln told you, whether this can work is pretty challenging. And it seems that you're even more challenged now than you used to be. So I think that they're the ingredients, particularly if people took account of their priorities, both for the U.S. and China, to imagine they would work harder on their problems inside their country in which case the external problems become more easily adapted or adjusted. So I like, as I mentioned in the conclusion of the book, I look for clues historically. Thucydides thought Pericles was brilliant for negotiating the 30-year peace. So basically what the 30-year peace was that Athens and Sparta agreed to each worry about their own problems for 30 years and freeze the external competition, in effect, for a substantial amount of time. Now then, that ended up breaking down about 17 years into that because of some mistakes.
Knowing that some of the questions will probably focus on contemporary events, I don't have my glasses, so if that says, does that say Q&A? Okay, great. It's usually what it means when a white sign goes up. So let me ask one question, and then let me, as I do so, urge people who have questions or comments to come to the microphone, and don't be shy, but do pose questions if you could. My last question for you, Graham, is a little sort of contemporary, and when we last spoke about the book, I mentioned this with you, but didn't have a chance to hear your response, so I'm going to take advantage of being with you again. So the one scenario we don't see in the book, as I read it, or in the cases that you pore over, is a scenario in which a status quo kind of ruling power, as you would put it, self-abnegates or self-abdicates, both. There is a dimension to the current U.S. leadership, whether it's pulling out of treaties potentially, or slashing funding for the United Nations, or humanitarian funding, if you believe that that's a source of your soft power or your leadership in the world. Or even one of the things that has irritated the Chinese and others for a long time, which is America's human rights leadership, standing up for people who are being oppressed abroad. Even pulling back from that is a form of sort of pulling away from at least one form of leadership, however imperfect it has always been. So that's not a scenario, if I read your cases correctly, that one sees. So I have two questions out of that, and maybe don't quibble over the premise, if just for the sake of argument, because one can argue there's different forms of leadership being exercised. But do you think China right now relishes the vacuum or the relative retreat on the global stage? And again, the pockets of leadership, I concede. And does this sort of change the war scenario or the war probabilities? Or do you have a case where certain individuals, let's say in the executive branch, may be on a certain path, pulling back from certain things, and again, back to the domestic and the public, which I think is such a big and important part, particularly of the Democratic story. Is it the case where you're going to have a misalignment potentially between a set of leaders who might be actually comfortable pulling back from leading in a certain way because it's been very costly or because they find it hypocritical or whatever, but the public or the Congress, that just as a culture, as a political culture, we won't be able to tolerate being number two. So you get the kind of worst of both worlds, which is inherently destabilizing. What does China see when they look at it and think, hey, okay, the feast is ours? Or do they think, uh-oh, this is even worse than a proselytizing America and an America that was at our door on climate, but at least what we could do a P2 agreement and then lead the world together. Like they seem more okay for now with the lead the world together arrangement that we had come up with, I think, by the end of the last couple of years.
Okay, complicated, but very interesting. So I think for sure, if you could see this in Xi Jinping at Davos this year, when the U.S. is absenting itself on any front, China wants to be respected. China wants in Mandarin, China means center of the universe. So Chinese believe that they belong at the center of the universe and everybody else should adjust themselves as showing respect. So if there's a space, they're very happy to move into it. And I think in the climate arena, he relishes that. I think in the international economic arena, he relishes that. Actually, with TPP, you're going to see the Chinese do their version of a local agreement. So that's kind of like, okay, more space for me. Now, then the question of whether I then, or how that relates to what clearly is very serious domestic demand, both in our democratic system, but Chinese have not democracy, but they certainly have a lot of sensitivity to the views of the population. And their social media is afire, and extremely nationalistic. And part of what Xi Jinping has done to re-legitimize the party, you can't re-legitimize communism. I mean, everybody knows that's dead. But they have a party that wants to lead and to say, okay, you're supposed to defer to me because I'm part of the party. Well, why? Because we're making China great again. And you can be proud to be Chinese. So the nationalism is a huge part of that. And to whatever extent our nationalism that says, well, we're simply, as I think Secretary Tillerson said at one stage, no, we're just not going to allow China to go to its artificial islands. Which answers, well, wait a minute, are we going to fight about some islands in the South Pacific? Maybe not. Okay, so we got off of that. But I could easily imagine, while we are readjusting our understanding of where we're going to be the dominant power or take the lead, and China moving into the portions, our nationalism and their nationalism becoming really problematic. And then if you want a very negative scenario, if I'm failing at home, historically, when leaders are failing at home, they don't blame it on themselves, they blame it on somebody else. So I think in the case, Xi Jinping is certainly afraid that what Trump has done with North Korea is said, well, nobody else has solved this problem. You can solve this problem, and you're solving this problem is the test of our relationship. But if nobody else has solved this problem, how can I solve this problem? Which answers is very hard. So I think you could see an externalization, especially is an attempt to try to shift responsibility to blame somebody else rather than blaming myself. Both for Xi, if his economy should not be going well as for Trump, if things weren't going well for him.
It just seems in any of those scenarios, the fact that our public, again, the thing we know best, even if we don't know it at all, it turns out, the thing that can't be good is the insufficient appreciation we have even of the dynamics that you describe in the book. And again, that's why I think the book is so important, because it shows that these tectonic plates have shifted, are shifting, will continue to shift. There may be some countervailing pressures as well. And our self-perception has not adjusted even a little bit, it seems. To you, sir.
Over the last half century, U.S. policy elites in their mad pursuit of global hegemony have killed and wounded millions, from Kissinger's saturation bombing in Vietnam and Cambodia to Obama's destruction of Libya, and we squandered trillions of dollars. We have a very sordid record. We're universally almost hated in many countries around the world. Can China actually forge a more benign world power status for itself? It's shown in some of its early forays into Africa and other countries that it's much more sensitive to the native cultures than the U.S. ever was, and more reluctant to intervene, certainly, and militarily or in other forceful ways than the U.S.
Got the question,
has
sir.
been.
Excellent question. Go ahead. Graham, do you want to take that question?
Good. It's a good question, because if the U.S. At least if we look for certainly the 21st century, even under both a Republican and a Democrat, the U.S. often reaches for a military hammer first. So the joke about if you have the biggest hammer in the world, everything looks more or less like a nail. China is actually, in the Chinese thinking about military force. Military force is the very, very, very last resort. As Sun Tzu explains, and I have a discussion of this in the book, if you have to use military force, this is a failure. What you're supposed to do is achieve your purposes without the use of military force by surrounding the entity that you need to move with such power and such such an obvious correlation of forces that the party goes along with what you need them to do otherwise. So that's number one. Number two, I also agree with the gentleman that in the American case, we believe that, as our Declaration of Independence says, all men and women are created equal, and they are endowed with the right to govern themselves. And we encourage other countries to have governments like our government, like democracy. China does not care how somebody else governs themselves. They don't want them to have a government like China. They don't propose, why don't you be more like us? Indeed, I think Americans, especially naive Americans like me, most of us think probably everybody wants to be Americans. You know, if you scratch the surface, everybody would like to be like the U.S. The Chinese don't believe anybody else is good enough to be Chinese. So you and I cannot become Chinese citizens. We could speak Mandarin and we could live there all our lives. No, we cannot be Chinese. So I think the two cultures, in fact, I have a chapter in the book called Picking Up Sam Huntington, Clash of Civilizations. These are quite different civilizations, and while in many ways they're sharply different, this may provide some opportunities for finding ways to accommodate.
The one thing I would add, if I may, just in terms of Chinese military presence abroad, we're seeing it now as China over the last decade has gotten massively involved in UN peacekeeping. So they are now the second biggest financial contributor to peacekeeping among the P5, indeed the second biggest in the whole UN, and the biggest on-the-ground troop contributor to UN peacekeeping, which of course is a misnomer because where peacekeepers operate by and large are war zones. Now, so far, and the Secretary General and I live this together, that has not produced, to my knowledge, a very large domestic debate in China. But last summer, for the very first time, China took its first casualties in peacekeeping, 2 Chinese soldiers killed in South Sudan at the beginning of a horrific outbreak of violence there. The question that I presume happened in their version of the Situation Room was, okay, how do we respond? Do we toughen up? Are we going to protect our people? I mean, in other words, this idea of benign presence, okay, well, what do you do when your people are getting killed or just minding their own business trying to protect civilians? Do we fight back in order to protect our people, or do we bunker down and, kind of basically hang out inside?
So what do they do?
They hung out inside. And doctrinally, they are now pulling peacekeeping, seeking to pull peacekeeping into a much more passive kind of 1990s posture than the more aggressive posture that the African militaries and others believe that they have to adopt in war zones, because, again, notwithstanding the prior question, this assumption that there's a way to operate merely benignly in places where, rape camps are being set up and civilians are being massacred, I think isn't borne out in a lot of the places that foreign militaries are deployed. And many of them are deployed not for the sake of their own national flag, but in the interests of, the words of the UN Charter. And China is now very much at the vanguard of that among large countries, but is quite ambivalent about how to be exercising that presence in volatile situations. Why don't I take a couple, just because now the line is getting a bit longer, and then Graham can answer them both. Thank you, sir.
Oh, hello, sir. I guess it can't be Harvard without students pushing back, so I guess I will push back. After World War II, obviously we have both the U.S. and Russia, being bipolar power in the world. I guess, right now, obviously we don't know, we didn't destroy each other. So are you do you expect that the development of nuclear weapons already broke this trap that you're talking about? And I just want to get your thoughts about the role of international bodies, perhaps with China last year with the ruling from The Hague. like ASEAN, for instance, Cambodia vetoed the statement rebuking China's role in South China Sea. So I just want to get your thoughts about whether or not, international bodies such as ASEAN can prevent the trap from triggering.
Great. Thank you. Before you do, Graham, we'll just take one more question if we could, sir.
Yeah, it really is a follow-up on what he was just saying, because the trap applied where it did not lead to war, there was basically two things. One's where there were two democracies involved, right, like Great Britain and the United States. And the other was between the United States and Russia during the Cold War, where you had mutual assured destruction. So if you're talking about destined for war being a nuclear war, why would not the mutual assured destruction apply in the case of China?
Good, very good question. So, and I do think the two are complementary. There are 4 cases in the book in which no war. And as you mentioned, one is the rise of the U.S. To surpass Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, and the surge of the Soviet Union, who, when John Kennedy became president, he thought was going to overtake the U.S. within a decade or two. That became to be the Cold War that ended with a whimper rather than a bang. So, and there are 2 other cases, but I'll just talk about those 2. So if we take the U.S.-Soviet competition, a key element in it, as you say, was the 2 parties had got to the point where a nuclear war would kill them both. So I describe this in the book as when you get mutual assured destruction, basically you and I have become Siamese twins. Whichever head, whichever arms, but our backbone has been fused. Our respiratory system is fused. So you may decide that I'm annoying, that I'm dangerous, I'm evil. You may even want to strangle me, but you think, wait a minute, if I do that, I'm also committing suicide. So that makes you extremely cautious, even accommodating. So you have to find ways to try to live with me. That was a crucial element in the relationship and in the prevention of war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And the same dimension is one of the ones working positively in the case of the U.S. and China, because people in the U.S. and people in China, the military people and security people, know that if anybody comes in and says, do I have a good idea for you today? Why don't we attack the Chinese with nuclear strikes? Other people say, you're out of your mind. Do you think this is a good day to commit suicide? Which answer, no, maybe not today. Okay. So secondly, it's not the only positive ingredient to build on. The U.S. and Chinese economies have become so deeply entangled that sometimes even people write about, one country, 2 systems, Tom Friedman's quip. So basically, if for whatever reason there was a war between the U.S. and China, there wouldn't be anything to buy in Walmarts, and Chinese factories wouldn't have any place to sell things. Besides, where would we get loans, for the U.S. government? So that's another. Third, how about climate? Excuse me. If the U.S. does everything conceivable itself and China does nothing, the problem stays the same. If China does everything conceivable itself and the U.S. does nothing, the problem essentially stays the same. But it's a problem either together we can create a livable environment or we can not. Okay, that's a choice. So there are a lot of ingredients to build on in trying to think about how this might work well. All those things being said, though, because if we go back to World War I, in World War I, all the leaders knew each other so well. Indeed, they were cousins. They went on vacation with each other. The Kaiser thought he was British. I tell in the book the story where he's meeting with Teddy Roosevelt at the funeral for Edward VII, and he tells Teddy Roosevelt, he says, I'm really British. He says, I love England. He would wear, the thing he was proudest of, he would wear the British naval uniform at the regatta that his cousin, the King of England, would run. Okay? So they're very closely, economically, the place totally entangled. Educational people, very thickly involved. And nonetheless, and neither of them wanted to go to war with each other, absolutely not. But external events triggered a sequence of events that end up producing the outcome nobody wants. So that's, I'm not, this book is not pessimistic. It's certainly not fatalistic. It's to say, how can we learn from the cases of both failures and successes to avoid Thucydides' trap in this instance, particularly given all the advantages that we start with. On the other gentleman's question about ASEAN, I think it's another long question, a very, very interesting one. One would bet that the laws of economic gravity, in which China has become the dominant economic relationship for every one of the ASEAN members, will lead to the unraveling or the weakening of ASEAN. That would be my bet over the next 5 years, because big guys prefer to deal with little guys one-on-one, rather than ASEAN's about ganging up against the big guys so we can deal with these problems ourselves. But I think as you've watched what happened in the Philippines case, they were able to go to the International or the Permanent Court of Arbitration. They were able to get an absolutely clear finding, and China said, forget about it.
Similar to a prior ruling power.
Can I just follow up with one more question?
Sir, there's a huge line behind you.
another line.
Do you mind just after,
if
during
you go
the
back,
book signing?
Yeah, we'll get you after if it's okay. Samantha is reminding us when the U.S. CIA mined the harbors in Nicaragua in 1983, the Nicaragua went to the Permanent Court of Arbitration and said, wait a minute, this is illegal. And Abe Shays, a Harvard law professor, was the lawyer for the Nicaraguans. And they won the case hands down. And the U.S. government said,
never mind.
Forget about it.
I just want to get your historical input on the natural evolution of democracy seems to be into an oligarchy. And there's a good argument that the biggest oligarch is running the biggest democracy now. And so I wanted to see what you think the effect will that be, because it's not turned out very well for past democracies. And the second one is the peace possibilities of the Mideast for a three-state solution, where you have Israel and you have the West Bank and Gaza as separate states.
Thank you, sir. We're just going to take additional questions, maybe two more. And if I could ask you to confine your question to a single question, that'll make it easier to get through all this questions.
Right now, the situation with North Korea and their nuclear weapons has been characterized as a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. I hope it can be avoided, certainly. The U.S. and its power in the 20th century provided a nuclear umbrella for Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. I wonder if you think there's any possibility in getting out of this current situation with North Korea, if China could offer to provide a nuclear umbrella for North Korea, enhancing its position as a hegemon of the East, as a legitimate world power. I wonder if you think that's a possibility down the road for getting out of this very dangerous situation with North Korea right now.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay, let me go quickly. I think thinking about what's happening on the Korean Peninsula, and obviously the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon knows a lot more about this than I do, and he and I were just discussing it yesterday. I think this is way more dangerous than we've appreciated, way more dangerous. And I won't do the long version of it, but I just would remind you that if North Korea, Kim Jong-un, just keeps doing exactly what he's doing, within not 13 days, like the missile crisis, but say 13 months, he will he'll test an ICBM, which the American intelligence community will say gives him the capability to strike San Francisco or Los Angeles with nuclear weapons. That's hard to imagine for this tiny, isolated, impoverished country, but it can already, according to the American intelligence community, deliver a nuclear weapon against Seoul or against Tokyo. So it'll be able to do one against San Francisco. From the first instant that he heard of this problem, which he heard of from President Obama, because in the handoff, President Obama said to President-elect Trump, I'm leaving you a big crisis. And he immediately tweeted, and he said, ain't gonna happen. That was his first tweet. Until last week, he continues saying, I'm not gonna let this happen, for sure. So he's moving, the two parties are moving inexorably, like we saw in the missile crisis, to a fork in the road. where Trump is going to have to choose between either attacking North Korea to prevent it, conducting tests that would give it the capacity to strike San Francisco, or finding some way to live with it. And I would say, stay tuned. If we strike North Korea, the American intelligence community believes North Korea will strike back against Seoul and kill about 1 million people in about a couple of hours. And then the U.S. and South Korea will try to destroy all the North Korean missiles and artillery that could kill another 10 million people. And then we have the Second Korean War. And for those of you who don't remember what happened in the First Korean War, buy the book because I have a good description.
His question was about the nuclear umbrella.
And about the nuclear umbrella, figuring out how I spent 2.5 days with the Chinese ambassador Shui, who was the orchestrator of the Chinese side of the Mar-a-Lago summit. So we were doing a post-mortem on the summit. It's clear to me that the Chinese are as enthusiastic about Kim Jong-un as we are. Okay? So if they could strangle him, they would. The question is how to figure out how to do it. Can anybody figure out how to do it? So I don't believe Kim Jong-un would accept a Chinese umbrella feeling comfortable. And I don't believe, I think the Chinese are certainly prepared to think of radical things now. And maybe an umbrella would be a conceivable one. But I think Kim Jong-un is the problem. He now has 20 bombs. He's shown he can do this himself. He knows that nobody likes him. He knows he can thumb his nose at everybody and get away with it. This is a striking case of a out-of-control entity that's extremely dangerous for everybody and that manages his affair. Back to the oligarchy question, that would be another long conversation, but I think it is very interesting. Tom Friedman, as I mentioned, his quip had this nice line about the U.S. and China are now so integrated that you have one country, two systems. And a Chinese fellow who was at this postmortem said, with the arrival of the Trump family, he says, we're feeling a lot more comfortable because now we have two countries, one system.
Ouch. Okay, we're going to run through, I think, all of the questions. I just ask you to keep your questions super, super short just so we can get through them all, and Graham also to keep your answers short.
Just based on what you've been saying, it seems like this relationship with China is quite a dark horse. So my question is, what's next? How do we take the lessons you've put forth in your book and actually crack this open for the general public to understand what's happening and understand its importance?
So that'll be a good excuse to give your conclusion to the evening. So, yes, sir.
Hi, good evening. To what extent do you see the U.S. military presence from Guam all the way up to Japan is eventually looking like a threat to China?
Great question. Yes, sir.
Hello. Unlike rising of Japan a few decades ago, do you believe that rising of China, they can successfully transport their economic power to political power? Then if so, then what is the differences between rising Japan and rising China?
Great. And last question.
Sorry, at the beginning you spoke about Sarajevo in 1914 and the alliances, the blood alliances and marriages that led to the First World War. Currently now with China, we have the CEPOL, we have the Silk Road Project in CPEC in Pakistan, which is creating issues with the alliances with India, Japan, and Iran, and then development of the Chinese agreement with Pakistan, specifically illustrated by the port of Gwandar and Chabahar. And that seems to be much more interesting over the long term than the issues that we're going to continue to deal with North Korea. And that's both economic and greatly outside the Straits of Hormuz. So I was curious about that and those alliances over a long period of time, and where you see that going specifically with India and China and those tensions, and of course with Pakistan.
Thank you. Great set of questions. Let me take them backwards and just, again, not do justice, but briefly. So I agree with you that one of the most interesting things that's happening is the reach of Chinese power as economic power then ends up having security consequences and even political consequences. And there was Xi Jinping had a conference last week on One Belt, One Road, which is this project to basically build both a sea lane and a land lane, rail lane, from, from Shanghai to Rotterdam, to move freight, to move people, to move everything. And in the course of it, to build fast trains everywhere and to build ports everywhere, and all of this emanating from China. And last week he had more heads of state in China than at any time, not the head of state from the U.S., but more heads of state than any time since the Olympics. So a huge number of people interested in this, and this is actually happening. They're putting a lot of money into it. In fact, most people don't even realize, but in development loans now, China already is about 4 times larger than the World Bank. Already 4 times larger. And this is going to be another, he says, $1 trillion. We'll see, how it plays out. So I think that's very interesting and very hard to watch. On the question of the rising Japan and how is this different, basically the rising Japan rose and seemed to be on this trajectory to rise forever, and then basically went kaput. And if China tomorrow should have a hard landing, this would be fascinating to watch because, as I said before, I don't think Xi Jinping is going to blame it on himself. He won't blame it on their own program. Much better would be to blame it on somebody else, to externalize this. And I think that would be a very dangerous scenario. I think in the case of both Japan and the rise, and the Soviet Union and its rise and challenge, the fact that ultimately the Soviet Union's economy proved not to be able to surpass the U.S. was a huge part of the reason why this story turned out successfully. On on Guam and the U.S. military bases in Japan and South Korea, do they look like a threat to China? Absolutely they do. Absolutely they do. Would you imagine if we had adversaries' military bases in Cuba? John Kennedy thought that was a big problem. Okay? We can remember. Or how about if they were in Mexico, or maybe in Venezuela, or in Central America? So from a Chinese perspective, if you go look at the map from Beijing's perspective, the anomaly in this situation is the U.S. How is it that the U.S. Navy is the arbiter of events in the South China Sea? And I explained to Chinese colleagues, well, wait a minute. We won World War II. That was part of the reason how you came to be the country that you are. The U.S. Navy won the Battle of Midway. We've been there ever since. We've provided an economic and a political security and economic order that's allowed you to grow. You should be grateful. And they say, thank you very much. That was then. That was now. It's time for you to leave. So I have another chapter in the book which Americans, some will like a lot and some will hate. Okay? It's called, What If Xi's China Was Just Like Us? And I tell the story of the rising America through the eyes of Teddy Roosevelt, who was supremely confident this is going to be the American century. And if China should behave the way the U.S. behaved in that case, then there will be no hope.
I think the last question was the first question, which was the broader, where do we go from here, knowing what we know that you've made us aware of in a way we hadn't been sufficiently before, what now?
I would say two messages. First, wake up, extreme danger. Extreme danger. When a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power, that creates conditions, not that leads one to attack the other, no. Creates conditions in which incidents and events, otherwise inconsequential or manageable, trigger sequences, cascades that produce outcomes nobody wants. So that's point one. Point two, only those who fail to study history are condemned to repeat it. So it's a cliche, but it's absolutely right. So there's no reason why we have to make the same mistakes that were made before. We can learn from the mistakes. There's no reason why we can't learn from the successful cases, like the rise of the U.S. relative to Britain or the Cold War. So what the book calls for is a burst of strategic imagination by the whole community that might be comparable to the subtlety and sophistication of Britain as it coped with the rising U.S., or of the Cold Warriors, who we celebrate as the wise men, but who invented a strategy for, quote, war, but as a metaphor, Cold War, without bombs and bullets. I think that the opportunity now is for another generation of people, and I think Samantha is going to be part of this, as well as some of you here, who are not the people that have already got so seeped in the Cold War like me that they're pretty much stuck in the views that we have. I think people that are going to think way more imaginatively, as imaginatively as Kennan did in The Long Telegram, or George Marshall and company did in imagining the Marshall Plan, a completely unbelievable idea, or as people did in creating the IMF and World Bank and international financial institution, or as people did in creating NATO, an alliance with guys that we just beat only 4 years before, or ultimately in SC-68 and a strategy for containment of the Soviet Union. That was a fantastic invention, and it provided a strategy and guidance for 4 decades. So I think the U.S. has shown a capacity from time to time for great strategic imagination. I think this is another opportunity.
Rousing conclusion. Of course, I think the thought bubble in everyone's head is, uh-oh, how do we summon that kind of not only creativity and expertise, but I think, again, one of the key points of tonight in the book, the domestic base, the faith in institutions, the faith in governance that allows us to be bold in a manner that can absorb a truly transformative set of developments in our lifetime. So that's where, while none of us here necessarily are going to be able to affect President Xi and how he steers the ship of state in China, and in one sense, China has a lot of dynamics in it that are very challenging for it, that will be confronting it, no doubt. On the other hand, it is an advantage that you have one man in charge with vast power. It's a disadvantage if you're a Chinese citizen, but it's an advantage, at least potentially, in making tough decisions. I think what all of us must take from here is that, as John Kerry just said in his Kennedy School address today, and as Louis Brandeis said, the most important office in any democracy is that of citizen, and we have to do our part shaping the underbelly, ultimately, of the vision that you have just painted, which is the democratic core supporting smart governance and supporting the kind of bold steps that you've described. But we got to get our own house in order to be able to do that, which is clearly a work in progress. But thank you, Graham, for the wake-up call. Thank you for the scholarship. And thank you for your service. Thank you, everybody.